One way to evaluate your Lewis structures is by looking at formal charge. Now, formal charge happens when atoms end up with more or fewer electrons than the valence electrons they brought along. Because remember, octets take precedence over keeping the number of valence electrons. So to calculate formal charge, what you're going to do is take the number of valence electrons that a molecule started with, subtract the number of non-bonding electrons, or the lone pair electrons, then mentally divide each bond in half and give each molecule half of the bonding electrons. So for example, if we look at our sulfur dioxide down here, we can see that our left oxygen came with 6 electrons. 4 of those are in lone pairs. And then there's a double bond which has 4 electrons in it. Half of them we're going to assign to that oxygen. So 6 minus the 4 in lone pairs minus the 2 from this bond gets me a formal charge of 0 on my left oxygen. For my sulfur, I started off with 6 electrons. There are 2 in lone pairs. There are 6 bonding electrons, of which the sulfur gets half of them, so it has a formal charge of a positive 1. Then my right oxygen started with 6, has 6 of them in lone pairs, and then it gets 1 from this bond, which gets it a formal charge of negative 1. Now, if you do formal charge correctly, the sum of the formal charges in a molecule will be 0. If it's an ion, your formal charge is going to equal the charge on the ion. So when you're writing a Lewis structure, you should assign formal charges to the atoms to then evaluate your structure. If you end up with formal charges, you'll want to think it through and see if there's a better way to draw the structure. So for instance here, we went over this example already. Let's do formal charges for our nitric acid. So our hydrogen is going to have, came with 1, minus 1 gets me a formal charge of 0. Our oxygen, this oxygen here came with 6. There are 4 in lone pairs. There are 2 bonds with 2 electrons each. So 6 minus, so it gets a formal charge also of 0. My nitrogen came with 5 electrons. Then it does not have any lone pairs, and it has 1, 2, 3, 4 bonds, 8 electrons, it gets half of them, so 4. So my nitrogen has a formal charge of plus 1. My oxygen over here on the right side, 6 minus 4 minus 2 gets me a formal charge of 0. And then my top oxygen here, I would assume has a formal charge of negative 1 to cancel out the positive 1 on the nitrogen. Let's check it. So 6 minus 6 in lone pairs minus half of the ones in the bond there gets me a formal charge of negative 1, just like I predicted. Now, formal charges of negative 1 and positive 1 are not a big deal. Those happen fairly frequently. If you get a formal charge of 2 or higher, you'll want to reevaluate your structure. So let's practice with the molecules that we drew in the last section. So why don't you pause the video and work through these formal charges, and then you can come back and we will talk them through. So here my carbon came with 4 minus the 4 in the bonds gets me a formal charge of 0. My oxygen, 6 minus 4 minus 2 is 0. Same for that one. My fluorine here came with 7 minus the 6 in the lone pairs minus half of the bond. Gets me a formal charge of 0. Same for this one. My oxygen here, 6 minus 1 is going to get me a -1. My selenium also came with 6 minus 2 in the lone pair minus 3 from the bonds gets me a formal charge of +1, which makes sense, so my overall charge is 0. Now moving down, my left oxygen here, 6 minus the 4 minus 2 gets me a 0. My nitrogen, 5 minus 2 minus 3 gets me a 0. And then my other oxygen, 6 minus 1 gets me a -1. And my overall charge is -1, so that one works out. Over here, all of my hydrogens are 0. We've seen this pattern in oxygen before where it has 2 bonds and 2 lone pairs. Those all work out to 0. The one where it has 1 bond and 3 lone pairs works out to a -1. And then let's check our phosphorus. Came in with 5 minus, there are no lone pairs, so just the 4 from the bonds gets me a +1. So we're overall at 0. All of these oxygens have this pattern that works out to -1, which means my sulfur here should work out to +1. So it came with 6 minus the 2 in the lone pair minus the 3 from the bonds gets me, yes, a +1 because my charge here is -2. All of my hydrogens here are 0s. My phosphorus came in with 5 minus 2 minus 3 is also a 0. So there's all of those written out. Okay, one more practice. Which of the following sets gives the correct formal charges for the elements in the Lewis structure below? I'm going to pause it, work it through. All right, our sulfur here, so for my S, it's going to be, came with 6. There are 4 in lone pairs, 2 bonds, gets me a 0. My carbon came with 4, no lone pairs, forms 4 bonds, so that gets me a 0. Then my nitrogen came with 5, has 4 in lone pairs, 2 bonds, gets me a -1. So my answer is letter E.